very much, Madam Clerk. Madam President, members on this side, members on the opposite side, all in the gallery. Pleasant good morning to all. Madam President, with your leave, I rise on the occasion of this special sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the independence of St. Christopher and Nevis. Madam President, I'm proud to be a citizen of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. I am proud to be a Nevisian. Our journey as a young nation has not been without its ups and downs. It has not always been smooth sailing. Time has proven, though, that we are a progressive people. We are a resilient people. We have been able to overcome numerous challenges on our journey through time as an independent nation. I want to quote my good friend, Mr. Kervin Benjamin, also called Infamous. In his song, he says, "As time rolls on and life goes on, be strong, and keep holding on." Madam President, I think it's very fitting that we have chosen to have a special sitting of the Nevis Island Assembly to mark the 40th anniversary of independence. Since, Madam President, the Assembly and the Nevis Island Administration are both creatures born out of independence. So while we celebrate independence, we also celebrate having the Nevis Island Assembly and the Nevis Island Administration. History tells us that Nevis had a local council a very long time ago, and that council was abolished in 1883. I don't know if it's coincidence, but that's 100 years before our independence. In the ensuing years, Madam President, government was administered in one form or the other in Nevis from Bastille. I am not old enough to have experienced those days, but there are many stories, written and verbal, that speak to those times. And for those of us on this side of the Narrows, regardless of politics, this assembly and the NIA has been all the difference for us. Madam President, I want to be a bit more personal in talking about the independence journey. I want to speak from the eyes and experiences of somebody who was born just 2 years prior to independence, who would have been an infant during the infancy of the nation and would have grown up as the nation has grown. From those early days in the 80s, where fetching water from the dump in buckets or jugs was the reality of the day, where it was customary to look after animals in the early mornings before the sun came up. We learned at an early age how to fork, how to hoe, how to weed out plants, how to plant vine, and how to dig potatoes. I spent my earliest days, Madam President, growing up in Pan Hill. And in those days, in the village, you had about 3 televisions, and there was a phone by the doctor's office. Madam President, you know where the doctor's office was? That's over there on the hill now. I think we have the Pan Hill Community Center located. Highland? see? Somebody with more elderly knowledge is telling me. But that's where the Gingerland, the Pan Hill Community Center is now located. So there was a phone over there. Mr. Curtin, who lived on the other side of the road, he had a phone. And there was a phone at Hilltop Restaurant. Madam President, nowadays when people give me their phone numbers, I put the phone numbers in my phone and I do not remember them. So if I lose my phone, I don't have anybody's number. But if somebody were to stop me and ask me for the number for, let's say, Hilltop Restaurant, I would be able to rattle that number off to them from my head. Because that was the first phone number that I knew. Because when family members used to call from overseas to speak to their sister, who was my grandmother, or one of my aunts, that's where we would go to take the phone call. So as a youngster, you would run down there between, you know, as they say, between people's legs, and you hope to get a little talk on the phone, because that was a big thing growing up in the early 80s. And when you wanted to watch television, Madam President, everybody used to crowd around one television in the village. So I got a little bit of that. Madam Minister who spoke before me said she missed out on it, but I got a little bit of it. Madam President, in those days, well, for me, one of the modes of transportation was we used donkeys and so on. You know, those of us who had livestock and we had to go to the pasture early in the morning, that was our mode of transportation. And when we didn't have donkeys, we used to run to the pasture and run, come back. I used to be very fast in those days. I know nobody could look at me now and tell, but you know, that's where the speed used to come from, because you had to go to the pasture in the morning. And I know we see the donkeys now roaming the street, and they are wild, and they're all over the road, causing, in most cases, a nuisance. But back in those days, not everybody had a donkey, because not everybody could afford a donkey, because you had to buy them, because all of the donkeys had owners. You know, Madam President, if you went there and you saw a set of donkeys running wild, and you were brave enough to go and catch one, by the time you caught that donkey, somebody would be coming up to you and telling you, well, you got to pay them X amount, because that donkey belonged to them, and it come out of this donkey, or it come out of that donkey. And that is how life was in Nevis back in the early 80s. And so it must not be lost on us now where we are coming from, Madam President. If you contrast where we were in those days to where we are now, I think everybody would agree that we have come a very, very long way in Nevis and in the Federation as a whole. Madam President, I remember a long time ago, come to Charlestown as a child. I remember what Charlestown looked like before the port project, before Samuel Hunkins Drive was done and upgraded. I remember when there was no Long Point Road and there was no Long Point Port. And I remember what the airport used to look like before it was upgraded and renamed in honor of Vance W. Amry of blessed memory. So, Madam President, we have a lot to be thankful for. I, for one, Madam President, I'm not wanting for in respect for those who would have led the country in those 40 years from independence until now, and even in the years from before. There were great men and women, names such as Bradshaw and Simmons, Douglas, from Daniel here in Nevis, and Amry, who I just mentioned, and Parry. And I'm very happy to see the Honorable Joseph Parry here this morning, because they would have done a lot to bring the country to where we are today. Names such as Gishard, can't forget to mention him. And even in the modern day, Madam President, I would be remiss if I do not mention our very own Premier, who has fought so valiantly over the years for us here on Nevis. And these are persons to whom the country owes a debt of gratitude for the service and the hard work that they have put in to get us to where we are as leaders. But contributions to the country was not just limited to the leadership, but ordinary members of society have contributed greatly to the development of St. Kitts and Nevis as a federation. We look at all of the businessmen who have spent their life in private business and so on, our cricketers, our other athletes, our calypsonians, all those who have contributed to the development of the country, our teachers who would have taught in our schools over the years, all of them have had a big part to play in the development of Nevis and of the Federation as a whole. Madam President, regardless of political persuasion or any of those things, we must be willing and able and mature enough to come together as a people to show gratitude to all those who have contributed to us being where we are today. Our democracy, Madam President, and I'm timing myself so I don't go over the 15 minutes because I tend to talk a lot when I have the opportunity. Our democracy, Madam President, was founded on 5 pillars. If you go and you read the Constitution of St. Kitts and Nevis, it starts out by saying, we as the people of St. Christopher and Nevis declare that the nation is established on the belief in Almighty God and the inherent dignity of each individual. I think that is very important, that we know the fundamentals upon which the country was built. We assert that they are entitled to the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, believe in the concept of true democracy with free and fair elections, desire the creation of a climate of economic well-being in the context of respect of law and order, and are committed to achieve their national objectives with a unity of purpose. Those were the fundamentals for the founding of the nation, Madam President. Madam President, the blessings in which we today rejoice, the rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence, bequeathed to us by our forebears and shared by all of us, are to be cherished and jealously guarded. We have come a very long way in 40 years, Madam President. Our leaders of the past have done their tenure, and it is now for the leaders of today to step up to the plate to lead the country going forward. Madam President, we must ensure this generation of Nevisians and Kittitians are fully equipped and ready to flourish in this uber modern time. And so a focus on education using all modalities at our disposal is vital. Education, Madam President, is the most empowering force in the world. It creates knowledge, builds confidence, and breaks down barriers to opportunities. Technology, Madam President, while an amazing tool for building, could also be a very destructive weapon. We therefore must guard carefully what our children are exposed to at an early age. I believe that we as Kittitians and Nevisians have a lot for which we can rejoice and be glad. And there is hope for a future that can be even more successful. But we can only continue to progress if we pool our efforts. It will take the efforts of all of us working together. Madam President, what we need in St. Kitts and Nevis is not division, not hatred, not violence, not lawlessness, but love, compassion, wisdom, and a feeling of empathy and justice to those who are less fortunate. I want to end, Madam President, and I think I'm right on time, by quoting the great Crefton Warner, King Miko. God bless our country, bless our native land, grant us the courage to change the things that we can. May it please you, Madam President.
In the absence of the Honorable Cleon Stapleton Simmons,